In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now, at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution. This series of episodes have been put together on the 50th anniversary of the creation of Montana's Constitution in 1972. Following 83 years under the Constitution of 1889, Montanans kind of rose up and said, we're tired of wearing this copper collar that represented the control of government and the economy and the culture of Montana by large vested interests centered around the Anaconda Copper Company and the large stock growers of eastern Montana. Those folks had helped craft a constitution in 1889, which was written by the powerful to protect the powerful. And it's worth noting, of course, that that constitution was written by 75 men. There were no women present because women didn't even have the right to vote then. And so they wrote a constitution that tended to protect them. And Montanans operated under that constitution for a long time. Even the press was mostly controlled by the Anaconda Company, and Montana was known to be like a colony of a large corporation, because the Anaconda Company, at one point during its existence here in Montana, was the fourth or fifth largest corporation in the world. People begin at the end of the World War II. A lot of the folks who'd gone off to war came back and under the GI Bill became educated. The women's movement emerged, and women were interested in playing a bigger role. The League of Women Voters and the Association of University Women participated in pushing for changes in Montana. And those changes took primarily the form of saying we want our foundational document, our Constitution, changed. And out of that, a Constitutional Convention was called and met in 1972. And assisting in the preparation for that Constitutional Convention, which was 100 citizens, no elected officials, they had to be citizens without holding office. Those 100 citizens met. There was preparation done for them by a cadre of research analysts that worked for the Constitutional Revision Commission and the Constitutional Convention Commission, and produced documentation that helped shape the information upon which those 100 citizen delegates acted. And today, on Last Best Constitution, we have a research analyst who helped produce that information relative to the legislative article, one of the most important of change that the new Constitution did in comparison to the old. So I want to welcome on board research analyst Rich Bechtel. Rich, I'm glad to have you here.
Well, thanks. It's a treat.
You know, we're utilizing technology today because I'm sitting here in the studio in Helena, and where are you sitting?
I'm in Noosa Heads, Australia.
In Australia. It's quite amazing that we're able to do this, and you didn't have to take a 26 or 30-hour airplane flight to get here to do a 1 hour verse of this. This saves you an awful lot of time, huh?
Oh, Lord, yes.
Well, Rich, we want everyone to know we're doing Zoom because if there are any glitches in this thing, we can excuse it for the technology. But it's good that we're able to have this. And Rich, we've known each other for nigh on to 45 years now, probably. I met you after the convention, and when you were working with the Blue Ribbon Commission. Among other things. So tell us a little bit first, if you might. I'd like people to know about you, about what brought you to the ConCon itself. I think you were a military brat or something, weren't you? And ended up in Glasgow, Montana. Tell us about all your journey.
You bet. I was an Air Force brat, and we lived all over the United States. And then I actually got to live and go to school in Germany and in Libya, North Africa, and then Spain. In my senior year, my dad was posted to Glasgow, Montana.
They had the great big Air Force base back there back then.
Yeah. Oh, it's huge. And then when I graduated, I went to the University of Montana, and I eventually was working on my MA degree, and I was a research assistant to K. Ross Toole.
Oh, the preeminent Montana historian, K. Ross Toole, and you were a teaching assistant with him or a research assistant?
Research assistant.
Hey, cool, really.
And I had a ball with him. I learned a lot, and my thesis was about the election of 1920 between Joseph Dixon and Burton K. Wheeler. And it was the first time that the companies, Montana Power and the Anaconda Company, didn't control both candidates. And they didn't control either one of the two.
That was the irony, was after all those years of having all the governors to that point had been Democrats, and they all had been company Democrats. And now all of a sudden they had two people running, a reformer, Joe Dixon, the reformer Republican, and Burton K. Wheeler, who certainly was not a friend of the Anaconda Company, although he was a Democrat. So that was quite an election they had to face.
Well, and one of the issues in that in the election itself was constitutional reform, and especially by Dixon. And so I was finishing the thesis. I got a note from one of my very best friends, Mike Fitzgerald, who you know.
Oh, Mike, yes.
Was in Helena, and he saw a news story saying that the Constitutional Convention Commission was looking for staff. And so I immediately applied, and then I was hired to do the legislative study, and I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Now that was a rather fortuitous thing, but the operation of the legislature under the old Constitution was one of the primary reasons people were mad about the Constitution. They could see every time the legislature met what was wrong with it, which was the secrecy of it, the no recorded votes or very few recorded votes. Tell us a little bit about the weaknesses of the Constitution in the legislative operations.
Well, they could go into an executive session at any time and then the public couldn't follow it at all.
They just closed the doors.
Yes, and the second reading in the House is the committee of the whole, and that's where a bill comes to the floor, and the entire body acts like a committee, and that's where all the really substantive amendments and debate and the position of each of your elected representatives is exposed. None of those votes were recorded. And so you really, only time they recorded the vote then was in third reading, which was just basically ayes and nays.
Yeah, in
So
fact, you could
The
see.
average citizen had no idea.
Yeah, I remember doing some research at that time, and I was maybe a few years before, and I was asked to research the votes in the legislature, and the third reading votes were like always 96-6
Yeah,
or something
absolutely.
like that. I mean, because all the work had been done, and you really couldn't tell where your legislators were on anything. There were they had biennial sessions that were 60 calendar days.
that's right. And so the clock never stopped. And when they did run out of time, they would simply drape a blanket over the clock. And
They'd unofficially stop the clock at 11:59 on the 60th day, and they wouldn't start the clock up until they finished their work if it took them a bunch of more days. But still, that was calendar days. So by the end of February, they were pretty much done every year, and it was, as I said, not much time to really operate a multi-billion-dollar operation like state government.
no, and Evan, at the time, or when the Constitution was written, it was not only written to maximize the company's control, but it was also at the time of the peak of distrust of state legislatures. The governors, the legislatures didn't have many agencies created, so they did most things on their own. And so if you wanted a divorce in Montana, you had to have an act of the legislature. If you wanted to incorporate a company, you had to have an individual act. And a bunch of the states went bankrupt building canals and that. And so legislatures were passed at that period of time to prevent them from being able to do anything. It was the ultimate distrust. And if you remember, because you were a real ace with the Executive Reorganization Committee, at the same time, the southern states were starting to rewrite their constitutions when we were writing ours in 1889. And they had suffered under what they felt carpetbagger governors. And so they actually stripped the governors of most authority by having 3 million zillion departments and boards and advisory committees. And so they basically paralyzed not just the executive, but the legislature was just.
Well, in Montana's case, then, we had the worst of all worlds. We had a weakened executive and a secretive legislature that operated in a constrained manner, and you had a weak government all over the place. And I like to always say that, the powerful don't need a strong government. The powerful do fine with a weak government. A strong government might benefit the regular people. And so that was what we were faced with for 83 years.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, when you did get over here, tell us about, you said you were hired, but tell us about that hiring process. Was that under the Reform Commission and then with Dale being?
It was under the Constitution
Convention Commission?
Commission.
Right.
And it was made up of really esteemed citizens from all over the state. Clyde Hawks.
The chair was
Brown.
All of these various people. Yeah. Really.
the chair was Alexander Blewett, who'd been a Republican legislator and a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate, but he was a respected attorney out of Great Falls. He was the chair, And then there were
They were all Evan. They were all known for their civic stance, that they
right.
really were interested in the public purpose. And they hired Dale Harris, and Dale was an absolute genius with organizational and in research capabilities. And I don't know if you remember, President Eisenhower created the ACIR, the Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Relations. It was the Cadillac group that reformed government across the country for advice, producing studies. And they drew on Dale a lot. They would bring him in and as a consultant and run some projects for them. So he was that good.
Dale he had started as a researcher over under Ellis Waldron, and then he got his fingers involved in even the Legislative Council recommendations on what needed to be changed in the Constitution. So from the beginning, Dale was through all the steps, through the Reform Commission, through the Convention Commission, to the convention itself, and from even back to the Legislative Council. Dale was involved in all of that. So when he died prematurely, as you know, regretfully. He passed away at a pretty young age. So we did in my previous series, in the Crucible of Change, we had a program about Dale, and we called it Godfather of the Constitution.
Oh my!
Very apt. And he was essentially your staff boss.
Exactly. Yes.
How'd that work?
And excellent. He gave you lots of room. And he also assigned, the deputy staff director was Jerry Halloran, who was really a fine, esteemed journalist. And of course, he cleaned up my writing, had taught me an awful lot about how to write a clear sentence.
Yeah.
Hold a clear thought. And so we had a great staff, and the colleagues were all really interested in the public service. How do you serve the public? And so that really was the theme throughout all the staff analysts, and we carried that through.
It's interesting that in these days of great division in the political world and the governmental world right now, and in the days as they are right now, where to think that both parties, and the independents and the Republicans, Democrats alike, all had a public service instinct at that time. I mean, that's such a world of difference between where we are right now, that you found, I guess you'd call them progressive Republicans or whatever, but it was hard to distinguish between the representatives of the two parties, because they all seem to be struggling together to make things better for Montana.
They really were. And unlike today, I shouldn't say that, but when I first started working on legislative issues in Congress, the Republicans were the conservationists.
Mm-hmm.
You had Democrat
conservationists, yeah.
Conservationists plus were. Senator Metcalf was one of those. And then that became, they kind of shifted to that party over time. But no, everybody was interested in how do you serve the public good.
Mm-hmm. So if we go back to the now, by the way, we're doing research. You might comment a little bit about how arduous the research was, because we had no internet, and we didn't have fax machines at that time. When you needed something from North Carolina, you had to have them make a copy and email or mail it to you through the post office, right?
Absolutely. And we drew on the law library constantly. And also, Legislative Council had an awful lot of resources. And I don't know if you remember Rosie Weber was the director of the council. She was phenomenally helpful. And I'm off the track a little bit, but the Legislative Council at that time had only really been established in Kansas, and it was then emulated. And it was a very innovative group at that time. And they had studies that my last work was with the Department of Revenue as basically an ombudsman, I could still draw on Legislative Council studies written in the 50s that were still state of the art in many ways.
You need to have those repositories of information, and now, of course, they're collected on the internet. But back then, you had to have a physical copy.
That's right.
And now, I think the law library you mentioned, Catherine Orchard ran that, didn't she? And and she was welcoming.
And Dale Harris, because he had worked for those previous review bodies, had developed an enormous library already from all the various states. So we had constitutions of all 50 states, and all the legal documents and all the landmark studies over the previous 100 years of our existence as a country. Those studies many of them were already located in Helena because Dale had acquired them.
And so you synthesized those into a legislative analysis that was provided to your committee, the committee of the CONCON?
Yes, and they all used that as a base resource before they came. And then when they arrived and we started meeting as a committee, that was all background information and knowledge to them. And they then brought their life experiences to bear on that information, and their values were front and center. So it was fascinating. We had three legislators that were very experienced. Mags
Osheim. Yeah.
What was the?
Now they were former legislators. They had to be former legislators. Yeah.
And they had all been, I think, at least 4 terms as legislators. And Mr. Leuthold was
John Leuthold from down in Absaroka area.
We divided into subcommittees, and he handled legislative procedures. He was the lead of that little subcommittee, and he, of course, brought in an enormous amount of information there. And Mr. Nutting
from Cilicia, he was. Yeah. Looked like the Carbon Stillwater County area looked like they were quite involved with the legislative.
Oh, they were at long standing. He too had a long term there. Now, I don't know if you knew, but he had like 3 Purple Hearts.
Oh yeah.
And when he was in a committee or just when you were with him, he had quite a presence.
Well, in keeping with the way we talk about Montana, that it's a small town with really long streets, and we all tend to kind of know each other. My dad ran against Dick Nutting for the legislature down in Carbon County, in 1962, and didn't make it. But Dick Nutting was in the legislature, but he had left the legislature, which made him eligible to be in the CONCON.
That's right.
So you're saying Maggs and Nutting and Leuthold were the 3 legislators in the committee.
And what I wanted to express is that each brought different life experiences to that experience. And so Mr. Leuthold, in committee, he supported the parliamentary proposals.
He's
Kelleher.
Kelleher's.
And Dick was in.
And Dick was in support of keeping the bicameral.
Yeah. Let's stay on that for a second, because it seemed like in the discussions we've had that since the convention itself was unicameral, they were sitting by themselves. They didn't have to push it off to another body like a House and a Senate. that a lot of the members of the CONCON itself were somewhat enamored of the unicameral concept. But according to the people we talked to, they've said, we knew if we stuck that into the thing that went to the voters, would it probably be defeated. So they made it a side issue. Tell us about that.
Well, on our committee, and for years after, Arlene Reichert was the main spokes and research person within the committee on the unicameral. And I don't know if you remember, Evan, but the legislature had looked at unicameral legislatures 3 times in the past and defeated it. In 1937, when Nebraska adopted theirs, and then twice more, as late as I think around 1963. And so folks knew that while it's probably the better legislative vehicle, now that there was no difference between the two bodies in membership qualifications, that that was probably the preferred, but they didn't want to endanger the overall Constitution, so they made it a side issue. But if you think about it, in no field of the review or consideration of issues, science, debate, whatever it is, you would never divide it up into 2 groups with totally different kinds of perspectives and have them analyze it. You'd bring them all together at one time so that you got the richness of that debate. And that's what really made the CONCON so successful too, is there was really rich dialogue and debate in my committee and then on the floor. And going back a minute, Evan, there was a deep respect among them. I can't tell you the patience it must have required to go through word by word, sentence by sentence, each of those provisions of the Constitution. And they did that with grace and in respect. And the part of it was, of course, I emulated all my life after that is make decisions based on sound knowledge that's been tested, and you know what works and what doesn't. Then you bring people together and they develop a rapport among themselves. And in the convention, they all started with respect, but they also then became almost friends. They put the most conservative, the 2 oldest delegates and the very most conservative were seatmates because they put them not by party but by alphabetical order. I don't know if you remember Mr. Studer and Mrs. Spear. And they became great friends. And that was reflected.
No, that was Studer, and who was the other one?
Studer.
And who was the other one?
Oh, Spear.
Lucille,
Lucille
okay.
Spear.
Okay. Lucille, yeah.
She'd retired as the documents librarian for the University of Montana. Yeah. And a just charming, fascinating lady.
No, those were, you would say, strange, you wouldn't say strange bedfellows, but how about strange seatmates? And yet that camaraderie, talk a little bit about the alphabetical seating as you saw it.
It was a brilliant idea because it broke. They didn't want, in the very beginning, they decided they did not want a partisan debate and dialogue and a convention dominated by partisan views. And so they decided they wanted to be bipartisan or nonpartisan. And then they decided to seat themselves alphabetically rather than by party. And as you all know, and most viewers know, most legislators they seat one party on the right and one on the left, and that's how they interact. And this was the very opposite.
And people became blind to their labels after a few days. It sounded like.
Yes.
It was just someone you were working with and your seatmate and you were talking with, and the camaraderie came naturally because they all seemed to be searching for solutions for the good of the state.
Well, and when you're munching on a sandwich with two colleagues next to you, they could be of totally different views. Eventually, you develop a rapport.
Yeah.
They liked each other.
So now, in the committee, they came to grips with annual sessions versus remember the biennial 60 days. What came out of your committee and was adopted was totally different.
It surely was. They decided they would move to the floor a unicameral and a bicameral, but each should be designed to be absolutely the most transparent and accountable possible. So the bicameral article was really scrubbed down and perfected, as was the unicameral. But all votes were recorded. Any substantive decision on a bill had to be a public meeting. All votes recorded. It was a really interesting document. And then they made sure that the Legislative Council was legal because it had been challenged in the past. They extended so it was an annual session, which was a continuous body. So if it were to adjourn, their committees could work until the end of that biennium. All bills would still be alive. They didn't have to be reintroduced, all of those things. And each legislature could extend the length of the next. And they could call themselves back into
session.
If they needed. Yeah, and plus as well as the governor. And so it was a really, really fine, open, transparent legislature. And that was on the very first day, Evan. The committee sat down and they decided they wanted to adopt some just general criteria to shape their work. And one was it had to be as transparent as possible in its work and accountable. All votes had to be recorded, all of those kinds of things. That kind of set the tone for how they worked through. And then they formed subcommittees, and each member would go off and do further research as to what they thought that subsection of the constitutional Article 5 should look like. And then they would have a long discussion and dialogue led by each of these subcommittee members. And it was really an effective, it brought out the richness of what a democratic process is, and that's dialogue with respect. And they basically, in my mind, they demonstrated how to do the government's business, and they demonstrated how to be a really fine citizen. And so that's a model for us far into the future.
So they came up with, instead of 60 days every 2 years, annual sessions, and I think it was 90. Well, now it's 90 days, but they had and they could spread it out and divide it up and so on, and so they did that. They also called for, as you noted, recorded votes on anything of substance. Any decision about a bill that had any substance was recorded publicly, so people would know who their legislators, how they were voting. And then, so about the question of knowing their legislators, they went from multi-member districts to single-member districts. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was really important. There was a major case, federal court case, that said it had to be one vote.
One man, one vote, yeah.
One man, one vote. And they had to really embody that in some fashion because the other old provisions were being struck through court. So they basically adopted the idea of one vote, one person, one vote. And then they had a very controversial, a couple of the reapportionments prior to the convention had been thrown out as not being.
The legislature did not make good reapportionment decisions, and the federal court did them for Montana.
right.
Yeah.
That's
so
right.
so they set up
And it was happening across the country.
yeah.
And so one of the major issues that the folks worked on, Mr. Scary, Mr. Kate, I've forgotten, there were a couple others, they focused on reapportionment. How does it to be done? And they came up with a very, very innovative, interesting process where it was to be a council separate of the legislature with 2 members appointed by the majority and minority members of each house. And
So that gave you 4, 1 from each party, from each house.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. And then they were to select a 5th as chairman from wherever that they could agree on. And that group was then to reapportion the state with all kinds of state resources, and then it would move its recommendation to the legislature. And the legislature could amend or change it, but that was basically the process.
I think that the thing was that if the 4 that were appointed could not agree, then the Supreme Court would appoint that 5th person.
That's right. That was the fallback.
And then when they came up with their recommendations, the legislature had an advisory role, but they could not change the decision. They could ask the commission, here we want to suggest a change here or there,
Yes.
but the power was in the commission, not in the legislature. And I think Montana was way ahead of the curve. Yeah, Montana was way, way ahead of the curve compared to most states.
Yeah. And it's a problem that plagues many states to this day.
Yeah, there's a lot of what they call gerrymandering, which is purely political decision making rather than something for the good of the overall people. Now, single member districts, to have folks know what that represented, let's use, for example, Great Falls, because Arlene Reichert, who was on your committee because she ran for the legislature in 1970, and they elected 12 people out of Great Falls, and she was 13th. And because she lost, she was able to be in the con. But think about that. If you were a voter in Great Falls, there would be 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans on the ballot at the same time. You had to try to figure out what you knew about 24 people.
That's right.
And the change you guys made through the legislative committee was every legislator, a House or Senate member, had a set number of people, citizens that they represented, and by themselves, single member.
A district, yep.
So as a voter,
And contiguous, there were a lot of requirements for how those districts were shaped as well.
yeah. But if you were,
It couldn't be a long thing that went around.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, Evan,
Yeah.
but in the early years of our existence, there was no Indian reservation that was within a single legislative district. Each was carved up. So
seldom was there
what population of Indians could vote, it was all divided, so it was dispersed.
yeah.
So that was historical. That went back for 100 years.
So if you were sitting in Great Falls then after this was done, your portion of Great Falls would be, there'd be 5,000 of you people there in that district. They would have 1 senator and 1 representative, and they would know who they were, and they could follow their votes because they were recorded votes, and it really was an empowerment of the citizenry in decision making. Yeah. Well, pretty progressive looking thing. We'll talk about more legislative thing, but I noticed, I'm looking over your shoulder and I see a bust up there, and it looks familiar behind you there. Tell us, that looks like a familiar person to me. Tell me who that is.
Well, Evan, that's Senator Lee Metcalf, and that's who I was a Montana intern for. Mm-hmm. And like working with Dale and Jerry Holleran. When I worked, I got the internship for a year, along with other people like Bruce Sievers and Roger Barber and
Jim Grady was Jim Grady.
yeah, all those folks. So I spent a year there, and his staff was an incredible staff. Unlike most throughout the Congress, House or Senate, his people tended to stay with him for their entire career, his entire career there. Very rare thing. And what was also interesting, Evan, is he wanted attention, creative tension within that staff. And so it was a really dynamic place. And of course, he had been a justice of the Supreme Court before he came. And he had such an enormous capacity of thought and thinking and impartial that it was a phenomenal school. And I took those lessons from there and applied them to every job I had after that, as well as what I had learned at the Con-Con. And in fact, they elaborated what I had learned in the Con-Con.
You know, Lee Metcalf had a capacity for finding these tremendous people to bring back there to work with him. So you were with a rather august group, even though you were young, and everyone was young then. And you think about 4 of your research analysts of the Con-Con became interns or fellows with Lee Metcalf, Bruce Sievers, Bruce Sievers, Roger Barber, Jim Grady, and you. And by the way, one of the Con-Con delegates had been with Lee Metcalf as well. That was Jerry Cate.
And wasn't Pettit as well?
Well, Pettit, of course, was not a delegate, but Larry Pettit was likewise. So when you were working with the Blue Ribbon Commission in higher education, you were working with Larry Pettit. He was a Metcalf intern as well. There was a cadre of amazing people who worked for Lee Metcalf, who did amazing work in the public sector.
His whole rationale for that internship fellowship was that he wanted people engaged in Montana government and civic life, and he wanted them to come back to Washington, D.C. and learn the congressional and federal processes and take it back and enrich the civic life of Montana. And it was quite an effective strategy. And he was a very foresighted man. Yeah.
Everyone speaks of that experience as being very formative for them, working with Lee. Now, let me actually, you benefited from that because you later became the assistant, and then ultimately the actual federal state coordinator was a position that the Montana government, the governors of Montana, had someone in D.C. representing our interests in addition to our delegation, working with the delegation. You worked in that capacity for some time, didn't you?
Yeah, I worked with as an assistant director for Governor Judge, and then Governor Schwinden, and then Governor Stevens. And the work was to bring the best knowledge from the state, put it in usable form, and provide it to our congressional delegation and then the committees at large in that. And it was a very, very effective model. A lot of states adopted that same kind of approach. What was interesting about Senator Metcalf's staff is when I took that position, I went back to them and asked them, how might I form an appropriations strategy? As you know, most federal law is implemented at the state level, and there's always almost always a federal appropriations component. And so we developed, with their help, a process where I could, every year I went to all of our state agencies I went to our major communities, whoever was having a difficulty, the tribes, the parks, and I would get their absolutely top priorities with their justification for that priority. Then the governor would look at those and put the top 10 as his recommendation to the congressional delegation, with the rest appended to it. And that I would take to the congressional delegation every year. And it was an extremely effective tool. And eventually the Republican chairman Hatfield, Senator Probst, and the earlier chairman from Mississippi and then Washington State, I've gotten a block on their name, they asked me to teach their states how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so then develop that kind of a process.
So the model you established became almost a standard, but for sure Montana was coordinating between its congressional delegation and its administration in Helena, using the model that you actually kind of you followed the original model, but I think you kind of perfected it quite a bit while you were doing that.
Oh yeah, and when I eventually I became the Washington director for the Department of, for the Western Governors Association. That was the 21 Western governors. And I had also, because of Senator Metcalf, he had passed a couple of statutes. The OMB had to
Office of Management and Budget, the budget guys federally, right? Yeah.
Yeah. They had to keep a list of every section of law and subsection of law when it was to expire and needed to be reauthorized. And I gained access to that. And each year, when I was still with our Montana governors, I used that to work a year to 2 to 3 years in advance to bring the best thinking of how Montana implemented a federal law. And we would then bring those amendments forward to our congressional delegation, and we focused on the committees where they sat. And those were almost always adopted because they were based on the ground, tried experience, and with creativity looking forward to the future. And then I modified that when I worked for all 21 governors, and we would do the same. And I would bring them major laws that were to be reauthorized 2 to 3 years in advance. They would tell me which ones they were willing to collaborate with on, and then I would bring teams together from all the United States to develop how best would you reauthorize this statute so it worked effectively for citizens. And then those amendments would be almost always a part of the chairman's mark. And the chairman's mark is what a committee starts from. And as you probably know, Evan, when you're a part of the original document, you've got to restrict your provision. So almost always they carry through. You're not trying to amend the bill. And so it was a very, very effective process.
You know, just listening to you putting that together and then applying it to 21, it's pretty clear that the legislative article had the cream of the crop when it came to the research analysts that were doing it, and we had a hell of a group. I want to take. I mean, Rich, you really display an awareness and a creativity that has served so many different things for the benefit of Montana and other states, and in our Constitution, let's go back to the legislative article and think about that committee. And can you give me a quick reaction to? I want to ask you about Arlene, because in my work on the Constitution, with she being one of the remaining at 96 now, kind of the grand dame of the con, if you will, right now, and with her history and everything else, give me some reflections on working with Arlene.
Well, she has has always had a crystal clear mind, and she was a research analyst in science. I've forgotten what the field
With the
was.
McLaughlin Center. She was with the McLaughlin Center up in Great Falls, yeah.
Well, she brought that scientific training and frame of mind to everything she did. And so she was very clear and could articulate her stances, always well supported and very logical. But more importantly, I think, because this is a human environment, a committee, and then on the floor, she is absolutely infectious. Just radiates life, charm, and what the world is all about. And so if they started out opposed to something she was moving, they pretty soon were with her, or they were doggone respectful. They knew that they if they were going against her, they had to have their arguments really well marshaled.
Now tell me about some of the impressions made upon you by delegates other than your committee. Some of the on the floor, the other delegates. Tell me some that stand out in your memory as being significant.
Well, I think Dorothy Eck
Dorothy Eck.
was again just such a gracious woman and so informed. She too was very, very persuasive, and who she couldn't sell, her best friend there, Daphne Bugby, who was an architect. She had so much training. I can't tell you what all her degrees were, but she was also in, I don't know if you knew, Evan, but in World War II, she was the poster wave, or whack, on all the posters across the country. She exuded energy, and between the two of them, another member didn't have a prayer.
Yeah.
But then a guy that was really on my committee, I keep going back to my committee, I'm sorry, Evan.
It's okay.
Carmen Scari was a really thoughtful and engaged man, very almost a compassion to him. And he reminded me when I first met him and worked with him on the committee, it was what a Jeffersonian farmer would be like. Someone who during the winter read all winter and was that informed of culture and society. Another person, well, of course, in my committee again was Reverend Harper. You couldn't have a more wonderful fellow to interact with. And again, incredibly compassionate and seeing the need of broad discussion and agreement. And so those were really priceless.
He was George Harper was a Methodist minister. He was one of what I think were five ministers. There were five ministers, I believe, in the convention, and he was one of them. As we were celebrating the 50th, and I know you weren't able to get here for that, but we were taking the roll call, and the family would answer for any delegate who had passed, and of course George had passed a few years ago, and so his son Rusty stood up and held up the bumper sticker that said "Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution."
Yes, he was. All of those ministers could speak. They were wonderful.
Yeah. Other delegates that come to mind.
I'm brain dead here for a minute. They all had such a broad contribution.
Let me ask you about your fellow research analysts, because I think they're such an astounding group of people, and you've now known them mostly for 50 years. tell me your reflections on what some of those folks brought to the table.
Well, Jerry Halloran brought a really incisive mind and the ability to write. He shaped I think all of us. Bruce Sievers had been a Fulbright scholar in Germany, and he had also been with the United Nations in, I think it was Brussels.
He was out of Missoula.
He was out of Missoula.
Yeah.
He was a PhD from Stanford, and he was a very thorough, thoughtful guy, and he became the first director of the Montana Council of Humanities.
And did the same thing in California, by the way, later.
Right.
Yeah.
And then went on to be the executive director of the Haas Foundation and the Gene Fortune. And
he's something, yeah.
Rick,
tell me about your thoughts about your knowledge of working with Rick Applegate.
Well, Rick was talk about a guy full of energy, and just there is nothing that he doesn't accept as a challenge, and by golly, he'll master it, and he does. Incredible mind. And what's especially unique about him is he has a sense of humor that runs through everything he does. And so he has witticisms, and he is just a really wonderful fellow.
When you put it...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He eventually went over and was, I think, one of the lead staffs for the Northwest Power Planning
Council. Yeah, a lot of
work on salmon, the broad Northwest work to recover the salmon, and that was all so important.
When you put him together in the Bill of Rights Committee with Chairman Wade DeHood, you had quite a combination.
Oh yeah, and again, Dorothy Eck, other people like that on that committee, phenomenal. If you were to Google, I think I did it a number of years ago. If you Google Montana Bill of Rights, it still comes up as one of the most progressive documents in the world.
Montanans, they tell me that there are 17 rights in our Constitution that are not guaranteed in the federal Constitution. That we are the most protected citizenry and the most empowered citizenry by our Constitution of any citizens in America.
I think that's right.
Well,
it was a phenomenally far-reaching document.
Yeah. Well, Rich, we're getting close to the end. It's funny how fast an hour goes. That's all right. It's been a most remarkable conversation, and I must say, with the most remarkable person. And I'm appreciative that you would, take the time out of, and we could utilize the technology this well to make connection. And in fact, this Zoom capacity, now that we have it, has been wonderful for you and I in our personal reconnection after so many years, and we want to be thankful to Zoom for that. We also did this with Jim Grady, who was another one of your research analysts.
And Roger Barber, they're just phenomenal guys that just formed the core of my best friends for the rest of my life.
That's remarkable. Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. You've added so much immensely to the series, and for those of you who are watching Last Best Constitution, we appreciate you tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you with the next episode.